Through this channel, I've investigated what may have been the truth behind the mystery of the picnic at Hanging Rock, and given you clues as to what Stanley Kubrick was up to with Eyes Wide Shut. Now, it's time to put Ridley Scott's futuristic noir classic Blade Runner under the spotlight. It's a film that I've seen many, many times, watched documentaries on, and read countless books and articles about, few of which gave too many clues as to what inspired the film's director, Ridley Scott, visually. And that's the key word here, visually. Blade Runner is an incredible spectacle of cinematic sci-fi eye candy, and I have often wondered where the team behind the film found their inspiration. So join me now as I take on the architecture, the fashion, the visual nods, and in doing so, hopefully answer the question of why it was voted by the Visual Effects Society as being second only to Star Wars, the most influential visual effects film ever in the history of cinema. Fashion. I'd like to start this journey by talking about the costume design of Blade Runner. It's a part of the film that hasn't been covered particularly well, and yet its impact on future fashion designers has been enormous. Just look at this tribute to Blade Runner shot for the March 1998 edition of Vogue Italia by photographer Steven Meisel with model Eugenia Silva. And this is just one example of the fashion industry's endless love affair with this film. There were two costume designers on Blade Runner. The more experienced Brit, Charles Node, who has largely remained silent on the topic of Blade Runner, and one the director Ridley Scott found by contacting the Costume Designers Guild and asking for someone young who had fresh ideas about sci-fi. This is according to an interview with the Financial Times that the second costume designer, Michael Kaplan, did back in 2017. Kaplan has made it pretty clear that the great auteur of 1930s and 40s Hollywood, the designer Adrian, was the source for Rachel's look. Gowns by Adrian was a familiar sight to cinema-goers in the 1930s, and he dressed all of the big stars of the period. Greta Garbo, Marlene Dietrich, Hedy Lamarr, Joan Crawford, the list just goes on and on. In a 2012 interview, ahead of an exhibition on film fashion at the V&A in London, Kaplan explained that, after reading the script, we definitely felt that Blade Runner was of the film noir genre, and we, meaning he and Charles Node, looked back to the films of the 1940s for inspiration. For Rachel's character, our chief inspirations were the tailored suits that Adrian designed in the late 1930s and early 40s. I wanted to create a futuristic heroine, who was believable in the future, but with her feet firmly planted in film noir past. Although he has never stated it, I would also argue that the actress Joan Crawford was a particularly strong point of reference for the look of Rachel. Tell me that you don't see Rachel in this scene of Joan from the 1945 classic Mildred Pierce. For the character of Pris, Kaplan said that his reference was the 1980 British punk film Breaking Glass and its lead actress, the singer Hazel O'Connor. This version of the story, however, differs from that of the actress who played Pris. In the official Blade Runner documentary, Dangerous Days: The Making of Blade Runner, Daryl Hannah explains her version of how her character ends up having her distinctive punk look. When screen testing for the part, actresses were asked to put together their own look for the character. The blonde wig came from a basket full of stuff. It looked ghoul, and I kind of built from that. The blackened out eyes and puttied over eyebrows, she explained, were inspired by the 1979 remake of Nosferatu with Klaus Kinski. Whichever story is true, the look was inspirational, and at least in some small part, played its role in the creation of the fashion style for cyberpunk. Mechanismo. Though I might be pushing it slightly with my cyberpunk origins, I can take it from the horse's mouth where other ideas for the look of Blade Runner came from. In speaking to Paul Salmon for his wonderful book Future Noir: The Making of Blade Runner, Hampton Fancher, the co-screenwriter for the film, explained that when tasked with finding a title for it, as Androids was not considered right, that he had chosen to call it Mechanismo. In his own words, I actually stole that from this beautifully illustrated English paperback which was out at the time. Mechanismo was this gorgeous coffee table thing, an art book chock full of futuristic illustrations. When looking at Mechanismo, it's not hard to see where perhaps some of the ideas for the iconic visuals in Blade Runner might have come from. Published in 1978, it was filled with illustrations by some of the greatest artists working in science fiction of the day. Could this floating ship by Angus McKee be the inspiration for Blade Runner's iconic blimp? Well, I have to be honest here and say that according to Paul Salmon in his book Future Noir, Ridley claims that the balloons come from his childhood seeing barrage balloons over London. Blade Runner's illustrator, Tom Southwell, has a different version. He has said that it was the Goodyear blimp flying over their offices in LA at the time when they were deciding on billboard visuals to be seen in the film. Whichever story you wish to believe, it's undeniable that the blimp is an icon of the film. And how about this spaceport by Jim Burns, looking like Tyrell's offices, where Deckard first meets Rachel? If you're not convinced that at least some of the visual ideas for Blade Runner came from this book, then I offer you this, a film still used in the book, which brings us full circle back to the original Android film, the first to be made, the classic that is Metropolis, a film that you'll see referenced again and again as an influence for Blade Runner. Then there's Sid Mead. You can't talk about the look of Blade Runner without talking about Sid Mead. According to Ridley, he first became aware of Sid's work as a futurist illustrator when he picked up a copy of his 1979 book, Sentinel. Although he thought that Sid's visions were a little bit too Flash Gordon, he felt that he had the right idea and could pull back on those tendencies. Coincidentally, Ridley wasn't the first filmmaker to make use of Sid's concepts. The idea for the Snowwalkers from Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back came from an illustration that Sid did for US Steel in the 1960s. Then there's the French comic artist known as Moebius, who has been cited as an inspiration for everything from Star Wars to Fifth Element. His influence is evident in his illustrations for a short story by Dan O'Bannon. And yes, that's the same Dan O'Bannon who wrote the screenplay for Alien, Ridley Scott's film before Blade Runner. The Long Tomorrow, published in 1975, features many visuals which bear a striking resemblance to scenes that we see in Blade Runner. There's no secret to this. Ridley has acknowledged the influence of Moebius, and Dan has gone on record as saying that while working on Alien, he showed Ridley the collaboration that he did with Moebius, like these flying cars and the iconic balcony scene, where Deckard looks out upon the streets below. And that brings us on to the architecture. It cannot be stressed enough how huge a part the architectural elements of Blade Runner play in fleshing out the story, as well as the world in which it is set. Obviously, a great deal has already been said about this, both in the Dangerous Days documentary, as well as in the definitive book Future Noir. And if you've listened to Ridley's director's commentary on the 25th anniversary Final Cut version of Blade Runner, you'll hear him talking about the set for Tyrell's office, a huge concrete construction influenced by the 1930s modern style, as well as concepts by Italian futurist architect Antonio Sant'Elia, who Fritz Lang was impressed by when envisaging his Metropolis. He explains that he had Larry Paul, the production designer, turn the pillars in Tyrell's office upside down because all the detail was at the top of the frame, and he'd lose that on close-ups. A decision which would shock anyone who is a structural engineer, but also one that shows that Ridley was more interested in creating art rather than realism. And those pillars got a lot of use. Ridley fooled you into believing that he was utilizing a different set for the scene in Tyrell's bedroom, in the scene in which Holden interviews Leon, and those damn pillars were even dragged out onto the Warner lot for this street scene. But aside from the detail spotting, have you ever stopped to consider the message that these monumental sets are putting across? Architects have. And in the years since the film's release, much has been discussed within this community about the warning that Blade Runner carries with it. It's all about the haves and the have-nots. The vast opulence of Tyrell's apartment versus the cramped and decayed space in which Deckard lives. Then there's J.F. Sebastian's apartment, located in what appears as a derelict apartment building. This building fits between the two worlds perfectly, and it comes as no surprise that the real building, the 19th century Bradbury building in downtown LA, is also built in the revival style, the same as the Enos Brown house used for Deckard's apartment. An architectural look that draws heavily on the past creations of Egyptian, Gothic and Renaissance architecture that was popular during the late 19th and early 20th century. There's a certain irony in using the Bradbury building that I don't think Ridley was aware of when choosing it for the film. It's been said that its design was influenced by Edward Bellamy's 1887 science fiction book Looking Backward, which describes a utopian society in 2000. In his book, he goes into great detail talking about the average commercial building as being a vast hall full of light. Whether Scott was aware of this or not, it's interesting that this play on light looms large in all of the buildings seen in the film. For example, the scene near the beginning of the film, which serves as the city police building, which we would otherwise know as Union Station. If you aren't already familiar with the Bradbury Building, the Enos Brown House, or Union Station, all of which have been used in numerous TV shows and films, but arguably never as interestingly as Blade Runner, then I highly recommend that you check them out on Wikipedia, as they all have a fascinating history. Moving on. The idea of there being this visible class divide using architecture is an insanely popular theme in sci-fi writing. Just look at Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, with its classes separated by the city and the outside world. Coincidentally, it's been rumored that there will be elements of a Brave New World in the in-development TV series of Blade Runner. Then you have The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, in which the Morlocks who live underground prey on the unsuspecting Eloi above. And if we turn to film, Metropolis also sees a class divide between the workers and the city's elite. And obviously in the book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, we see those who can get off-world. What happens in Blade Runner, however, continues that theme by begging us to ask, who are all these losers left on Earth to deal with the biblical rain? And yet when we're in Tyrell's office, we're treated to the only place in the city from which the sun is visible. So this clear linear divide between the haves and have-nots is much more apparent than you might have thought. This is all in large thanks to the work of Sid Mead, who I mentioned earlier. According to Sid, Ridley only got him in to do visuals on the vehicles, but his skill at rendering saw him become indispensable, and he stayed on, much longer than the initial 3 days that he was hired for. Sid's work is not only then seen in the designs of vehicles or the Voight-Kampff machine, but also in the background of several scenes as matte paintings. In an interview with Curbed, now part of New York Magazine, back in 2015, when asked about his influence for Blade Runner, Sid said that architects love Blade Runner. They just go bonkers. When I was working on the film, it was all about, let's jam together Byzantine and Mayan and postmodern and even a little bit of Memphis. Just mash it all up together. We called it retro deco or trash chic. He also imagined an upper and a lower level to his city. In my mind, all the tall buildings have a sky lobby and nobody goes below the 30th floor. The street level becomes the basement and decent people just don't want to go there. So you see, it's probably Sid more than anyone else who we have to thank for Blade Runner's iconic set designs. And I'm sure that Michael Dealey, who produced the film, also thanks Sid for playing his part in the enormous budget overspend. Like tears in the rain. There are so many layers to Blade Runner, so much depth of design going on in it, that I could go on forever, and still only scratch at a few of them. I have to stop somewhere. Although I desperately want to mention elements like the music. Vangelis's amazing soundtrack, including some of the dialogue, have been sampled more than twice that of any other film in the history of cinema, according to a list published in 2004 by Peter Segan. And Rutger's monologue at the end, which is also on the film's soundtrack album. 42 words that have an entire page devoted to them on Wikipedia, and have gone on to be mentioned in at least 2 other films that I'm aware of. Domino from 2005, directed by Ridley's brother Tony, in which we see a Tears in the Rain tattoo on Keira Knightley's neck, and the 1998 sci-fi film Soldier, in which we find out that Kurt Russell's character has fought at the Battle of Tannhauser Gate. And I also wanted to make a point about the irony of Blade Runner, the film that imagines a future which itself creates. Just think Cybertruck, which Elon Musk has gone on record as saying was inspired by Blade Runner. And then there's cyberpunk, and that whole chicken and egg debate. Fans of this science fiction subgenre will often say that William Gibson's 1984 novel Neuromancer was where cyberpunk was born, and yet Blade Runner's dystopian future, filled with anti-heroes trapped in a dehumanized high-tech urbanized landscape, appeared 2 years earlier. Then you have the name itself. Cyberpunk was coined by writer Bruce Bethke in 1980 as a title for his short story about teenage hackers, but this wasn't published before Blade Runner premiered. So the idea of creating a cybernetic, punk-fused future look for the film must have its origins elsewhere. In an interview with Film Comment magazine in 1982, Ridley Scott states that he saw the future of LA as being very Spanish, with a big cross-influence of Oriental. He then goes on to say that various groups are developing today faction groups, which are religious, social, whatever, and punk, some louts, who develop their own little culture of protest. And it's from this punk world that the cybernetic creations Pris and Roy, who Cine Action magazine called at the time of the film's release rebel replicants, have borrowed their punk new wave movement looks. Thus, I would argue, it is they who are therefore the original cyberpunks. And if you don't agree, then bite me. No, leave a comment below and let's discuss. And on a final note, I would like to add that since its release, we have seen Blade Runner's iconic look being reflected time and time again in films. Even the John Wick franchise, I would argue, has paid homage to it. Just look at this scene from John Wick Chapter 4, in which we're first introduced to the Marquis, and tell me that the idea for this didn't find its inspiration in Tyrell's office. Thanks for watching, and please consider subscribing if you like the work that I'm doing. It really helps.